All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first in the series of the Lunar Helium-3 webinar. We've got a great day planned today with a lot of great guests. So to introduce everyone, my name is Douglas Gorman. I'm a reporter for Payload. Payload is a publication that covers the business and policy of the space industry. I'm joined by Dr. Jack Gregg, author of The Cosmos Economy, Brendan Rousseau, strategy manager at Blue Origin, Catherine Toby, a scholar in residence at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Chris Salvino is kind of sitting in the wings. He's the CEO of the Lunar Helium-3 mining company. And then Rick Tumlinson, author of Why Space, The Purpose of People. So I think that to start a little agenda for the day, this is the first in a webinar series that will cover kind of every topic under the sun regarding the lunar economy and how it's going to come about. So I'd love to just begin by giving everyone kind of a question that aligns with their background, and then we can get into some general discussion. One kind of note, we do have a question and answer column. So if you're listening to this and you have some questions for the group, definitely feel free to write those in. And then I will, pick from the best, and maybe we'll have some time at the end there. So great. So to start, Rick, I'd love to begin with you. For those who don't know, you've spent kind of decades as the godfather of the commercial space industry. You've spent a long time kind of talking about and writing about the kind of shift from kind of the government program that has been driving the space industry for so long towards a more commercial enterprise. So I'd love to begin with your views on, from your vantage point, what makes the moon kind of the first place where this transition can really succeed at scale.
Oh, wow. And thank you. And I'm honored to be here. And thanks to Chris and his team for inviting me. Yeah, big question. I'll try and make it as tight an answer as I can. I'm an O'Neillian. Jerry O'Neill was my mentor, my boss, literally. So at heart, I'm a free space guy. However, the moon is the first island offshore from the Earth. It is a nice, filthy, dirty place, bathed in radiation and in a vacuum that has gravity. So for those of us who are interested in moving out to do the planetary civilization type stuff, I think it's a great training ground. In fact, it's a really good training ground because it's probably nastier and dirtier than almost everywhere else we're going to go, and covered in what I call razor blade talcum powder, which is lunar soil. And so I think it's a good spot for us to get going. It's also near enough, time-wise that we can do a lot of things out there, and go the back and forth time is going to be fairly minimized fairly quickly. So it gives us a lot. Then there's the resources that are potential. The entire panel's about that, so I won't go deep into that. But there is a panoply of those that are there. They're useful largely for moving out into space. Not so much, with the exception of helium-3 and a couple of other things, for export back to the Earth. But again, it's right there. It's a good place to practice. It's a good place to begin developing an economy that is off planet. And we've been there once, and I do agree. It's anybody who sees any of my writings knows I think it's time to get back there.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. And I think that we're definitely going to get into the discussion a little bit today on kind of where we've been and where we're going. But just to kind of introduce everyone, Brendan, I see you nodding a lot over there. So I'd love to hear your view and kind of how the work that you're doing has informed it to, why the moon is now kind of a destination, not just a destination, but a market. And then any of the things that kind of need to arise to really make that market, viable and self-sustaining.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me, and it's great to be on a panel with such amazing people. And Rick, I agreed with everything you said. I think part of why this topic is so important and why I'm excited to talk about it is because one thing we've learned in this past, call it decade and a half of the commercial space revolution is that we can bring in the private sector to do familiar things a lot cheaper and better. And we've seen how that's expanded what's possible. Starlink is a great example. The capability like Starlink would have been unfathomable even just a couple decades ago. And we're seeing how not only SpaceX, but the company where I work, Blue Origin, and hundreds of younger, smaller companies across the spectrum are really jumping in to discover what we can do in space and bring down costs of the things that we already know are valuable, but make them more accessible, cheaper, better, et cetera. I think that's largely defined the commercial space revolution so far. What I think is still an open question and something that we're all hoping for and we all believe is out there is that part of this story, part of the changes that have happened in this marketplace today is allowing new things to happen, allowing us to truly push the tip of the spear forward and bring in, new capabilities, new benefits for people, not just space nuts like us, but people across the spectrum. And I think there's no better symbol for that maybe than our push for the moon. We've been pushing for a while. We've long known, we've been there 50 years ago. We've long known that there is value, there is science to be done there, there's resources to be done there, there's, enough water now that we could make a water park, albeit a pretty cold one. But this is really a test case, as I see it, of can we organize ourselves, our public and private sectors, to get together to push the tip of the spear forward? I think it's easier said than done, but Helium-3 is a great long-term example of, if we can make this system work and figure out the steps on the path to get there that are required, I think that there are real benefits waiting for us at the end. So I think that the journey will be worth it. But looking forward to hearing what everyone else is.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it transitions really well because I was just about to tap Jack, who's Dr. Jack Gregg, who's written pretty extensively and teaches on this topic, but about the kind of phases of industrial development. So I'm curious to hear your view, Jack, on where the kind of lunar economy sits today. I understand that it's been kind of very government driven up until this point, but it sounds like it's transitioning into a more commercial driven sector. So can you talk a little bit about kind of where things sit at this current moment in time?
Yeah, so I tend to look, and by the way, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. I think this is going to be a really great conversation. Um, I tend to take a kind of a longer term view. That is to say, what's going to really move us out into space commercially. And one of the major advantages of talking about the cislunar economy and the development of the cislunar economy is that it's an opportunity for us to shift from an Earth-based economy, because that's, by the way, all the customers and all the providers for current space activities are really right here. So it's an opportunity for us to shift to a kind of a space-to-space economy where the providers and the customers are in space. And that's a bit over the horizon, but I think that the cislunar economy is going to enable that to take place. And that's a critical inflection point, by the way. The next inflection point is actually to take advantage of a very kind of synergistic economy out there, if you take a look at the S&P 500 11 sectors, right, in industrials and healthcare and IT and all the rest of that, all that needs to come to play to have an integrated synergistic economy in space. And that's way over the horizon, but that's where the autonomy of a space economy is going to take place. But right now, that first inflection point, moving to a space-to-space economy, is going to be enabled by activities around the cislunar economic space. And I think that that's very exciting.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, I think that every sci-fi nerd in the room is definitely excited about that space to space, economy of mining something and putting it to use without having to bring it home. Definitely creates some sci-fi capabilities there. Well, cool. And then lastly, Catherine, to introduce you, for people who don't know, you've led programs where national security was a big talking point and consideration. So I'd love to hear your view on where this national security consideration fits into it, because obviously, every conversation around the moon this year has been, we're racing others, countries to get back there and then to set up shop. So I'd love to know, your view on kind of where national security fits into this whole conversation, and at what point does the moon become, from an exploration target to an economy target to a strategic asset for the country.
Thanks very much for having me. Great tough question as well. In my experience, the moon doesn't become a strategic asset as you call it when we declare it one. Uh,
Mhm.
but there's some practical considerations that have to be met. And and these are pretty big hills to climb. First, you need a sustained access at scale. And that's regular, reliable transportation. It's getting cargo back and forth, power generation, reliable communication. And this is where, the costs are predictable, the cadence is predictable, that governments and private industry can, plan these multi-year operations. The second one is a persistent infrastructure. And so once you have this power generation and data relay services, surface mobility kinds of things that are operating in a continuous fashion, not in episodic fashion, the moon then starts looking less like exploration and more like utilization and leverage. And then finally, it's this idea of mission relevance. And that's what cannot be replicated anywhere else, especially on Earth. So, cislunar domain awareness, deep space logistics, things that can only be done on the moon. And so, we need to look at the moon as a strategic asset in the sense that it's not going to be defined by a flag. It's going to, or who gets there first, but it's going to be who can sustain their presence, their logistics, and their decision advantage. Governments in this particular case are not going to be customers in the traditional sense, but they are going to care very deeply about assured access, about resilience, and continuity. And so there is going to be a competition, and it's going to be who can maintain that long-term presence.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate you kind of bringing up that point that getting there first is not the goal here. It's really sustaining a presence. If we use the kind of New World example from human history, the U.S. is not Leif Erikson's country. It's very much the English that kind of got here and set up shop and didn't leave. And that really became kind of what the driving force was here. So I think the same will be on the moon. Getting there first is not at all the work that is fully needed to really set up shop and have that as a strategic asset. Well, cool. Well, that's, the introduction's done. So I'd love to kind of get into a little bit of discussion. And I would remind the panelists just to, keep this conversational. Feel free to jump in, interrupt people wherever possible. So to start, I think it would be great to kind of set the stage of, all of the lunar work that's been done in the last, 50 to 60 years, from getting there and, planting boots on the moon first to, some of the rovers and obviously the commercial successes that have been logged in the last couple of years. So to start, I'd like to just ask kind of a general question about, where the lunar economy sits today. So obviously, companies have landed on the moon. There's money to be made there. It's not just government programs and then feeding money back into the government itself. So can you guys explain kind of where we sit now with this commercial sector that is obviously, planning missions to the moon, making revenue in those missions? What does that really say about the current state of the lunar economy, as we would understand it? Is it all government driven, and is there any kind of indication that that's going to shift into something that is a little bit more self-sustaining? And I'll leave it to whoever wants to jump in.
I'm happy to take a stab at it. It's a really great question, and it's one that's important to follow. I'd say for the time being, it's almost entirely public, and that's not a bad thing. I think sometimes people try to rush to be like, "Oh, look, there's a commercial marketplace there." It's fine. We what matters more is proceeding at the right pace and making sure that we have complementary capabilities that are getting us to where we want to go, not so much who's doing what and why. I think it's natural that so much of the activity right now stems from, at the very bottom, a government demand signal, whether that's for science or exploration or signaling, in a great power competition. But we've seen them apply public dollars and public programs in different ways than in the past. You mentioned this, in the past, whether it was the shuttle era or before our last trip to the moon, it would have been government dollars dictating the requirements and determining who is going to build what and why. And we've shifted to a model now where NASA and other government entities seek to be one of many customers, and they're looking to bring competition, the innovation and design freedom that the private sector can provide, real risk. So a lot of these companies will fail, but a lot of them will succeed, and that's how the process is supposed to work. And if I had to give it a score of how it's going, I'd say we're doing pretty well so far. I'm really encouraged by number one, the fact that the CLIPS missions, the CLIPS program has gotten the momentum that it has, that after a few early failures, we've had success, a really great success in Firefly and others that continue to take shots at the moon. Intuitive Machines doing great things. I think we're setting the foundations for something a lot more a lot bigger down the road. What I'm eager to have is a much more comprehensive, sustained demand signal where we're really bringing in the private sector in a meaningful way. I don't think that if I was starting a business for myself right now, I don't think that it would be easy to convince investors to put up the huge amount of money that's required to do it, frankly, anything on the moon. And I think that's an area where the public sector can look and say, hey, what can we do to better support these private companies that are trying to help us achieve some really important national goals? I mean, what could be bigger than a history-making achievement? I think in the short run, a lot of that energy will be focused on what the private sector can do. Will be focused on services. I think we need that first and foremost. Low cost access to the moon, which we're still working on, and I'm proud to be working at a company that in early next year is going to be sending the largest structure to the moon that's ever been there. So hopefully that goes well. And then once we get to the moon, power, communications, energy, transportation, everything. I think those will define the challenge for the next decade, maybe more. And then after that, I really hope that we enable the next wave of entrepreneurs and next wave of value builders to do things like resource extraction and things like that. So that was a very long-winded answer, but that's my thoughts on it.
I would
Go
agree
ahead,
with
Brett.
what Brendan said. Pardon me. The whole idea right now is to try to establish some kind of lunar infrastructure to enable people to play in that market. So there's no infrastructure there. So if you're an independent organization that wants to do business there, you have a lot of indirect cost to support that whole process. So those people who are willing to make a long-term, and I stress long-term investment to establish infrastructure elements are going to really be there to support the growth that Brendan just talked about and everybody's kind of interested in. There's something called the Lunar Development Corporation, which I think Chris is going to have in a future episode of this series, which is thinking very seriously about how to provide an integrated infrastructure in the cislunar economy. And that's something that you may want to explore a little bit more.
Mhm. I wanted to, if you don't mind, add to what Brendan was saying. We're very, very important, I think, for this entire seminar series, that we all keep in mind that we're having this conversation the day before the railroad. I mean, with New Glenn, with Starship, everything's going to change. Everything in this conversation will be obsolete in 2 years. And it's an important conversation to have, of course. It's like right now, if I were standing in Nebraska and I had a cornfield, and I'd be like, if I just had a railroad and some highways, this corn would be really valuable, right? So we're right there. That's where we are. We're investigating corn and wheat and the things that we can do on the moon. The other part of that, too, is the intersectionality of other industries arriving that we aren't looking for. I'll give you the example that's just hit me in the last few weeks. We've been talking about what can we do in LEO industrially, and then all my friends for 30 years have been running around going space solar power, space solar power. It's become their little thing, right? And all of a sudden, Google says, you know what? We're going to put data centers in orbit. Boom. That wasn't even a talking point 2 years ago. And
Right.
yet, given the AI crunch, the energy crunch, all of the downsides of data centers terrestrially, boom, suddenly we have this potential massive orbital market. And so having this conversation now is hugely important, but we should always keep in mind that everything we're saying right now is going to potentially be obsolete in the best way possible in a few years.
So, Rick, I agree with you. I think bringing in the non-traditional sectors of the economy is what is really going to fuel the um, the growth, and the vision of the moon as something more than a destination. But it does start looking like infrastructure, and a couple of us have used that word. I mean, if you can generate locally power and extract materials and export high value resources, and you're doing it from a 1/6 gravity well, then, the moon doesn't look like an interesting place. It looks like an economic, destination. And the thing is, infrastructure, people are not going to invest and develop infrastructure before the demand comes at scale, right? This is kind of a field of dreams in some respects, right? You have to build that infrastructure and then the demand at scale will come. The other interesting thing about this is standards, whether it's data standards, communication standards, behavioral standards are going to be set by those first movers. And so even though you may not be the first to do something, it's those that are creating the presence there are going to create those standards that don't exist today because we haven't really thought about governance and behavior. And then, finally, gravity, not optimism, is going to drive the long-term economics. I mean, that's one of the key elements of the moon and thinking about mining helium-3.
Yeah, awesome. And we're definitely going to get to the helium-3 mining question. Just want to set the stage first, but I'd like to just harp on one of the comments that Rick made about kind of orbital data centers. And we've done some research here at Payload in kind of our Payload Pro product where we really looked at the data center question and some of the literature from Google really talked about what's going to make it possible. So I think it's very interesting to know that like their idea of having data centers becomes economically viable when things like launch costs decrease enough. Like when they hit a point, then all of a sudden it's like hit the green light, let's get this up there. So I'm curious when thinking about the lunar economy and some of the questions about getting infrastructure up there, starting to extract resources. Do you guys have a certain metric or milestone that you're keeping an eye out for when the same, tide will turn? Is it launch costs? Is it a critical infrastructure being built? Is it, milestones that, regular launch cadence, anything under the sun? But are there things that, you guys are looking out for that some of the listeners here can also look out for when this kind of, feedback loop will start, churning itself, so to speak?
Mhm.
You want to start us off, Rick?
I was looking at you guys. I guess, first mile, middle mile, last mile transportation systems. If we want, and again, anybody who follows me knows my opinion on this, but what I call Artemis 1.0 plan is an absolutely perfect demonstration of exactly how not to develop an operational economic lunar infrastructure. You couldn't like make up something more clumsy, more insane, more crazy, and more costly and more limited in its long-term utilization, right? And so if you think about it, when I say the first mile, that's your starships and your New Glenns and the 4 or 5 Chinese versions thereof that are coming up. Nobody's paying attention to. So that's great. But then you get into on-orbit refueling and the capability to then send them over to the moon, to the island, let's call it. And then lunar surface to lunar orbit operational infrastructure. And again, all of these have to be robust. They have to be economic at scale. Um, um, they have to be, by the way, interchangeable and flexible. And that gets down to some of the most boring stuff possible. Standards, airlocks need to match, little things like that. Or, as my friend Dan Faber with Orbit Fab started demonstrating earlier, he went to satellite companies and said, have you ever thought about putting a gas cap on that thing? Right? Because if you want to refuel it, you're going to need a gas cap. I mean, it's that kind of boring, core, very base level stuff, along with the ideas of the regulatory environment and hopefully a positive tax and financial supporting environment, at least here in the U.S., which a lot of people are working on trying to get this administration to roll out something.
Yeah, I like the point Rick makes about the boring stuff is important. A great example is, when my sewage and my power and my Wi-Fi are working, it's boring. I don't think about it really at all. But when they don't work, then boy, is it really a problem. And it's those kinds of things that surround us every day that we don't even think about, but they're so important to the core of our lives in the 21st century that they've become boring. So I love that idea. That's something that I'm uh, weirdly optimistic for, is a day when space becomes more boring in some ways. The three quick trends that I look for, in terms of what it'll feel like when we're doing it, lunar development right, is cadence, scale, and what I call accretion. So cadence is just, are we doing things faster and faster? Are we really getting more shots on goal? Are we taking more chances? And to Rick's point about Artemis, I think that years in between really any meaningful progress is not helpful. Even if it's at a large scale, we need faster cadence. Second one is scale. It's great to do small one-offs and less than a metric ton rovers and things like that. That's phenomenal. We need to start with those baby steps, but you must keep moving to larger, more meaningful things. The moon is a harsh place. You need lots of power, lots of ability to generate heat and resources, yada yada yada. Scale makes economics easier, and I'm excited for us to bring more scale, and soon, hopefully. And the last one is just accretion. Are the things that we're doing there, do they build on one another? Are they like Legos that are building blocks, or is it like, something that will rot away once it's done and the lunar night comes? So those are three things that I'm excited for. I think we're working on those more and more, and I think we have a lot more room to improve on.
And I think, to your point, we're still decades away. But to draw some analogies here on Earth, when you think about strategic infrastructure that we almost take for granted right now, like semiconductor supply chains, although that has kind of come back into the national discussion, liquid natural gas, nuclear power, all of those things were dreams and ideas, and they weren't built kind of after that demand, appeared at scale. So they were built because someone saw a vision. They had a vision and they saw the curve coming. So, when you ask for like a milestone in rough measure, when we stop launching bulk mass to the moon,
Mm. Mhm.
whatever that is, whenever that is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's extremely interesting. And I think that I'm really curious here to talk about some of the work that's been in development. And obviously, some of these infrastructure pieces, at least demonstration versions, are starting to get funded by the US government. We're seeing talk of kind of nuclear power being sent to the moon, talk of like in situ resource utilization. I'm curious if you guys think that the current state of that kind of government funding goes far enough. How do we get from this moment where it's a lot of demonstration missions to those operational at scale missions, and does the government really have to fund it all the way through that kind of large scale buildup?
You know, I'd like to suggest that another thing to think about is kind of the endemic short-term thinking that
Mm.
that our commercial players are so focused on. And and part of that is driven by quarterly reporting for public companies and all the rest of that. But we're talking about very long-term things, right? And Rick's comment about, the short shelf life of all the topics that we're talking about. I mean, what we're just hearing now that the potential IPO of SpaceX is maybe with a market cap of roughly $800 billion. A lot of that driven by the data center element and so forth. I mean, that's a huge topic by itself, right? That's going to open the floodgates for a lot of investors, a lot of IPOs and so forth, that may in fact move the whole equation forward on developing a cislunar economy or at least an autonomous space-to-space economy. But that takes a lot of change for the way that strategic planners and organizations think. I mean, they have to go back to that room with the hidden whiteboard about planning 30 years ahead and say, gee, we need to change the equation on this and this and this, so forth, to a longer term kind of investment strategy. So, if you're a venture capitalist and you want people to come in for a longer term instead of a short term exit because of the nature of this whole emerging industry. And I think that's a tough thing to sell to people, I think, especially because of their traditional way of thinking, very short term in and out of the market. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Rick, you might have some thoughts about that.
A couple. Um, Now yeah, the VC thing, which I need to be clear. I stepped away from Space Fund a year ago to work on my book, left it in some capable hands, but I'm very, very proud of it. It was a very small fund, $20 million. We had 21 companies. I think 19 of them are now successful, which is a pretty good ratio, shall we say. And very happy with that. But I learned so much doing that. And that, look, this and I'm sure when we're talking with Chris and the other members of this team, we have to acknowledge that the return curve on something like Helium-3 is going to be decades, other than perhaps some small sample utilization that comes in the early proof of concept stuff. So you really got to be ready for it. And by the way, when we say decades, people are like, "Oh my God, space takes so long." No, if you look at some of the major resource utilization, mining, all of these types of things on Earth, they actually do take decades. It's just that we're in the flow now and they're constantly happening. But if you go from the start of, hey, we need a particular mineral, to the scoping out of where you find it, the politics of getting it, the design, the ability, all of that, and the infrastructure that leads to that item showing up in a consumer's ability to use it, those that can be decades. So we do have to be aware of that. But in the meantime, there are all these other things that we can do along the way, and those can produce revenues. And again, I go back to the data centers. What's the next thing coming out of left field going to be once Brendan's team is able to provide low cost access to space or landing on the moon? We have a lot of brilliant people at it. The one thing I do say is regarding the secret whiteboard, as long as those are in companies, that's fine. But the secret whiteboard of the government one, so far, it would be your negative indicator. Whatever they've got on their secret whiteboard as to the long-term plan, I would probably do something different.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's a very interesting conversation about this kind of timeline because I think it really harkens to the fact that the government is so critical and will be critical for the lunar economy for the long term. And the example I
They're
point to
critical,
is,
Douglas. I don't mean to, they're
yeah,
critical.
no,
They're super important, but they cannot lead, right?
yeah, that's a good point.
That's the
Yeah.
key.
Yeah, and I think the example that I was thinking of was kind of the terrestrial nuclear energy industry, because when you look at the returns of the returns of that industry, it's again much longer than any VC would be comfortable in investing in, which is why
100%.
the government needs to kind of step in, provide the capital, so that returns can take, 1, 2 decades to materialize. And I
Right.
think the same is true for any project on the moon, is that in the short term, the government needs to step in to be able to, you know, keep the funding going while
Yeah.
those returns materialize. Catherine, you unmuted. Do you have any comments to share on that?
Yeah, I'd like to just talk about the geopolitical nature of the moon.
Yeah.
And it's no longer neutral. And I don't know if it ever was, starting with Apollo. And so governments will always have an interest in the moon, but I am with Rick. They absolutely cannot be the anchor tenant,
Mm,
just due to the the life cycle of how funding and requirements and vision, sort of get set. So, the United States, if I were to, put myself as, a mouthpiece for them, they're not interested in revenue, right? They're
mm,
interested in resilience. That I mean, they don't want to make a profit off the moon. They want assured access to whatever is the most important thing on the moon, which is going to be strategic materials and resources. They're also going to want domain awareness within the cislunar set of orbits and on the surface of the moon itself. And then you look at, well, what would China want? They most certainly want long-term presence in cislunar and on the moon surface. They also have a very high degree of interest in the energy resources associated with the moon, and they play the long game. They're willing to invest in multiple decades and timelines to make this happen. But what private industry brings that these governments can't is speed, capital efficiency, decision making, innovation cycles, just a whole different thought process of how to get, infrastructure in place quickly. So to think that governments are the ones that have to be the first movers or can move the fastest probably isn't the case. We need
yeah.
private industry, and we need coordinated private industry to get to a place where the infrastructure is stable.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Last point you bring up about the coordinated private industry, and I think that when you say that government can't be the anchor tenant, it really makes me curious about kind of what then is the anchor tenant. So um, this is obviously Lunar Helium-3 Mining's uh, podcast and webinar, and I want to get into the Lunar Helium-3 mining implications. And I will just remind anyone who's listening that there are more webinars in the series that will talk about the use cases for data centers, the use cases for the nuclear energy industry. So, we can leave those, specific topics off. But I'm curious about the coordinated private industry piece in that, if what Chris and LH3M are trying to accomplish is going to go ahead, it obviously needs a ton of infrastructure. A little bit to what Jack talked about, these indirect costs. So how does that infrastructure really come about? Are we imagining that, Chris and other, resource mining operations are going to have to raise a, boatload of money to be able to fund this? Is it going to be government driven? And then if anyone wants to really talk about all the specifics of that infrastructure that's going to be needed, I think that would kind of create a good scene as well.
Okay, damn it. Um, we all keep waiting each other out here. Uh,
Yeah.
the government role here is to be a good supporter of the brilliance of their citizens' own free enterprise inclinations and capabilities. That's the role. If I were, and I've written about this many, many times, if I were redesigning Artemis into what I call Artemis 2.0, and I hope our friend Jared is paying attention, the 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 um, the current private sector activities of the clips and all of this that's been going on, it would flip. Rather than being a sideshow, that would be the center. right? And that would be where the support would be going, is that the government would be working to support these other entities by helping reduce. What do we have on the government side? We have a great set of labs and amazing researchers that can help buy down the cost of early research costs, the early TRL numbers, 1 to 3 or whatever, can be brought down by taxpayers having already paid for all of that. The government can look at working on commonalities. Everybody on the moon is going to need a version of a bulldozer, right? Or a backhoe, or these kinds of things. Now, I'm not saying that the government should become the new caterpillar on the moon, but the government can incentivize those industry segments into developing those commonalities that we need. The thing that Brandon was talking about, like, if the heating and all this stuff breaks down, I cannot tell you how concerned I am on the moon about lunar soil, the regolith, the razor blade talcum powder. We're going to be faced with I'm jumping way ahead. We're going to be faced with a new disease, right? It's going to be, I'm going to call it LLD, lunar lung disease, right? Because that stuff is so nasty. It's going to get into everybody. We need to start learning how to mitigate these kinds of things that we already know about. The people on Apollo know, right? And you can go back and talk to some of the Apollo infrastructure people about things like, what did the gloves they were wearing look like after just a few days on the moon? They know about this. So we can start applying these kinds of long incentives. Then there's tax breaks, right? Then there's, these other sorts of incentives that the government can get in and do, where it doesn't have to do it itself. It could buy data. It could buy samples. There's a whole slew of things where we don't have to replicate an Apollo government does it for us model, but government supports us doing it ourselves model.
That's a great point, Rick. There's a section in our book where we talk about one of the key ways that the United States has changed its approach to space, or at least some of its approach to space in the past couple of decades, and we call it private provision of public goods. So what is a public good is one of the key things that the government does. It's these things that are non-exclusive, that they're super important to our society, but they're rarely provided well or enough by the private sector. Things like education, things like basic science and research, things like national defense and a reliable energy grid. There's all sorts of things that we want, very basic fundamental things we want the government to be doing, because if they don't, no one is going to do it well enough. But that doesn't mean, to Rick's point, that government employees need to be out there building the power plants or building the trucks or doing whatever. We want a great transportation system, but we let companies like Ford and GM and others build the cars, because sometimes the private sector is better at providing this form of public good. And that's one of the things that I think we should lean into more when it comes to really accelerating and expanding lunar activity. I think we need to really recognize in a meaningful way as a country that there is something valuable about the moon, and that we should make a full-throated, real effort to do the best that we can to establish a real presence there and expand America's values and abilities to be on the moon. I think that's something that's great for all American citizens and for citizens of the world. I think we're sort of taking half measures right now. We're signaling that we are doing something big. We have a very large rocket that launches very impressive things to the moon, but I don't think it's a serious long-term solution. And we've known that for a while. I'm eternally optimistic. I have seen and read too many times about the government doing remarkable things, especially in national crises, pulling off whole of nation activities that the private sector was a major contributor to, but could never have pulled off on its own. So I'm a believer that our government can and should really live up to its potential and bring about that ecosystem that we've been talking about. So I think there are better days ahead of us, and I'm excited for companies like LH3M to really play a leading role in that.
I'm really in support of what Brendan and Rick and Catherine have been saying about what the government has done in the past in terms of supporting research and so forth. But given some recent developments in terms of what the government has stopped doing, what happens if they abrogate and give up funding all this research and so forth? Is the private sector, in fact, ready to step in and do that? Because I think that that's a serious concern given recent developments in the last year, where we've seen university research being gutted in a lot of institutions. So we can't just take that as a given anymore. And so you have to take a look at the private sector. How are you going to fund that without the government support? How are you going to step into that? How are you going to define what the critical elements are so that you can use those dollars more effectively? And that's not just one company. That's a broader scope of companies coming together and say, okay, we have to create a new vision. We have to create a new vision of what commercial space looks like. The old visions are very altruistic and very nice, but they're not business plans. So
Hmm.
a new vision for commercial space incorporates a lot of economic sectors and bringing them together. And that's not an easy thing to do because not every company has the same end goal in mind, right? In the same way of going about doing it, but they may share in some similar needs. And so that's a big challenge. And I don't know if I see that any place. If I see that on the horizon, I haven't seen that. Has anybody else seen any efforts in that direction?
I will
No,
jump in again.
is the answer.
Uh, uh, no, no, no. I actually let me take that on, Jack.
Okay.
And by the way, my author friend said that everything I say for the next year is going to end with "It's in my book." But it's in my book. The analysis, in the absence of this not of this being space, you're exactly correct, right? If we were talking about the development of, more capable desks, you know, fairly dry subject, da da da. This is a case where the two leading billionaire investors, right? I wrote an article about this recently where I was saying there isn't really a race going on. The two leading billionaire investors and almost everybody I know in the new space movement, yes, they're driven by the idea of a bottom line, but they're driven by a belief.
Mm.
This frontier right now is at the phase where it's being opened by a belief set that these guys, and in the book, I say that Jeff and Elon are not opening space to make money. They made their money to open space.
Mm.
So that's a bit of an anomaly. It doesn't fit. But if it's to translate into an economy, then we need everything you're saying, Jack. But this first wave that's being pushed out, the startups, the guy, yes, you have to raise your money, you have to pay your bills, especially if you're not a billionaire. You have to have a bottom line. But I think that this one is going to be one of those cases. A friend of mine, my friend Dylan Taylor, talks about that we are driven not so much by a need, which is drive a traditional business plan, but
Right.
by a capability. And he
Mhm.
loves to wave around his iPhone. He goes, nobody knew we needed this. We've got the capability, and now look at all the things and how central it is to our lives. Nobody knows, smart business person knows that we need Brendan's company to succeed and we need Starship to succeed, and then the universe changes. But that capability will arrive, and then a scad of business plans and other activities will take place riding on the back of it. So we have to keep that in mind. It's not all the bottom line anymore. It's where the line is in our imagination.
Yeah, I think you make a
Very
great
good.
point, Rick. And it's about surprises, especially when you bring in the market forces and you let them operate and work their magic over time. You can bet on there being some pretty unique surprises that pop out of that equation. One of my favorite things to think about is the first rush to San Francisco in 1849, it was 49ers, it was for a gold rush. And I love the idea of grabbing, a miner who's taking a train over to San Francisco in 1849 and be like, what do you think, San Francisco is going to be like 150 or whatever years from now? What do you think they're going to be exporting? And what do you think the business is going to be around? And they'd be like, well, hopefully a lot more gold. And I'd be like, boy, oh boy, would you be surprised? Even the most brilliant business person, if you asked, what is Silicon Valley doing 150 years ago? It's amazing. And I don't know if the moon will follow that same path or what will happen next. That's part of the plan here is that there's surprises that come out of it. But for me, stories like that are a great example that even if you go for one reason, and there's plenty of examples of people settling in a place for one reason, and then over a few decades, they transform pretty quickly. I have a hard time imagining that future lunar settlers or business people or whoever are going to look back and say, "Boy, why did we make this big effort to go to the moon?" I think that's never happened before, and I think we're going to be glad that we did this time.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time, and I think that this comment that Rick brings up about leading with a vision was something that I discovered very early on covering the space industry. I think the quote that I read early on was, how do you encourage people to build a navy? Well, you don't teach them how to build boats. You make them yearn for the sea. And I think that is all over the space industry. I think when you look at the amount of time and work that people are putting in, it's not just for their paycheck. It's very much to build something and build something well. So in the last couple minutes we have left, I'd love to just end on a sour note and ask you guys kind of what are the most likely failure modes of all of this kind of optimism. What could happen in the next, say, 10 to 15 years that really makes all of these business models untenable? There's a lot of optimism in the space industry, and I think that throwing cold water on that is useful. So do you guys have kind of like things that keep you up at night, unknown unknowns, those kind of things that might, we should be on the lookout for to really try to avoid or spot?
You reached for the unmute, Rick. You want to kick us off?
No, you know what? I think you're right. I think we're depending on. I mean, the biggest problem we have in the U.S. is our national leadership, our government, the lack of vision, the attunement to the old way, what I call use it and throw it away, big aerospace approach to space. Um, they're like some football player that won the Super Bowl 50 years ago and think that's the only way to go now, right? And it's a completely different game, So that's my big worry that they won't get past this. That within that is that we could have ideologically flipping back and forth administratively. I'm an independent, but I don't have to explain all this to people on the right. They're just like, let's go, let's go, let's go. But the people on the left are like, oh my God, we're going to go pollute space and da 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 da. So that's my biggest worry. I think the other one is our own, and I say this myself, look, I was in a lunar company in the 1990s, right? My own over optimism, and I think we have to be careful, especially in all the following shows about Helium-3, that we don't overpromise and underdeliver. We've got to be our own worst critics, and that will make us stronger. That'll make us more investable, and it'll make it easier for us to achieve. When I was doing VC, and everybody I run into in this field who are doing investments, my biggest thing that I say to people, other than if I see you flying first class, I'm not investing. But other than that one, is don't overpromise, underpromise, and overdeliver.
I'd like to take it in a completely different direction, and that's looking back at the Outer Space Treaty that said, space is the province of all humankind. And it's now becoming a strategic domain.
Right.
And what used to be peaceful uses of space, was a Cold War bargain. It was space was non-sovereign. It was military activity is going to be limited. Exploration was for the good of the planet. And what really worries me is the politicalization of space, militarization of space, and the lunar surface. And that could come in many, many different forms, and it could limit the amount of investment that private companies would want to put into space and the moon. And so it's just, can we go back to fulfill that sort of basic promise that the Outer Space Treaty sort of put in place in 1956?
Yeah, I mean,
Jack,
yeah,
Brendan,
your original question is what keeps you up at night? I mean, everything. This is what we are trying to do here. The subject that we're talking about of building and sustaining a meaningful permanent presence on the moon, not only as, just a small outpost, which that itself would be historic, but to do it commercially, to actually try to export things back to Earth and everything. These are near impossible dreams that we're pushing on, and uh, that's amazing to me. I love that we are pushing on things that are so hard and so challenging, and that failure should be expected at every step of the way. But the reward is that if and when, it really is a when more than an if, because all the trend lines continue to move in the right direction, and I think they will continue to. When we get to that destination, I mean, the projects we're talking about today make the great voyages of the 18th and 17th centuries look like a pleasure cruise. I mean, we are taking real steps forward. And especially today when there's so much kind of zero-sum thinking and pessimism, I feel very glad that the space industry, and especially the projects that we're working on now, feel like a spark of pushing something forward. It's very hard. There's going to be tons of setbacks, but I do think that we'll get there, and we shouldn't let inevitable hurdles in the coming years and decades knock us down. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm glad to be working on this with all the folks on this panel.
Yeah, and I think I speak for everyone when I say that, unfortunately, Brendan, I think we're all happy that, you're not sleeping well at night. I think it means that Blue Origin is working on some really forward-moving things, and hopefully you can sleep once the work is done. So, Jack, do you have any final thoughts on kind of what keeps you up at night, like what the biggest failure modes might be for, this whole cislunar economy?
Nothing that I can really add to what's already been said by Catherine and Brendan and Rick and so forth. I think that they did a really good summary of those types of things, and so I would support that. I really can't add to that list. I thought that was very good.
Okay, yeah. Well, great. Well, it looks like we're almost out of time and we didn't have any chance for questions, but I just want to point out one comment that someone made, and I think it's really insightful to just how far we've come. The anonymous attendee said that, all of this talk about, if I can find it, all this talk about anchor tenant reminds me of conversations that sound like developers talking about space opportunities at a strip mall. So I'd like to leave it with that like that's how far we've come in this kind of lunar journey, that we're starting to discuss things as if it's a foregone conclusion that, there's a shop out there, we're going to set up shop and then, start printing money. So, yeah, I would encourage everyone to, maintain, keep eyes on this space. I think in the next couple of webinars, LH3M is putting on, there'll be a lot more discussions about the lunar helium-3 mining proposition, and everything that it'll take to really make that industry, both viable and commercially sustainable. So with that, I think we're all out of
I,
time. But yeah, sorry,
can I,
Chris, you want
let me throw up two last slides if that's okay. This has been
Sure, yeah,
fast
yeah, take it away.
to work real quick. Tell me if you could see my screen.
I can see it. Yep.
So I think in summary, a little bit from my point of view, we've looked at this, going back to the moon as a government cost center. That's what we've done for 60 years. But I think as we will explore in the future, we're going to be discussing helium-3 as probably the only real use case in which we can bring back an economically viable product. We'll be talking about this in the future. It's a $17 trillion future revenue stream off of nuclear fusion if we can make it actually work. And then I'll leave you with this slide. So the next topic we're going to be going over on January 21st is going to be looking at helium-3 versus tritium. So we're going to assume that helium-3 comes off the moon. We're going to be exploring fusion. So the next topic will be about fusion in January, and it won't be so much about how to extract. It's going to be a fusion plants had a choice between helium-3 and tritium. Which one would they pick? Helium-3 is the only sustainable green energy. It's the only one that doesn't require storage of byproducts. So that will be explored in January, and then February we're going to be looking at quantum computing. How are you going to cool quantum computers down without helium-3? So that's kind of how the series will lay out, and it should be kind of interesting over the next couple months to a year or two.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. This is a really great chat, and I'm really excited to see what my colleague Rachel does for the next round of webinars. So yeah, thank you guys again, and I hope everyone has a very happy holidays.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.